Hi, good morning, welcome everyone. My name is Anjali Badlow. I'm a Senior Evaluation Officer in Sustrans Research and Monitoring Unit, and I'm going to be giving an overview of sort of monitoring and evaluation tools and techniques that can be used to monitor active travel schemes. This is based on sort of Sustrans our music experience in monitoring and evaluating delivery of active travel schemes through Sustrans' work. In terms of the structure of the presentations, I'm going to go through some key terms related to monitoring and evaluation, talk a little bit about the benefits and why you want to invest in monitoring and evaluation of active travel schemes. I will introduce logic mapping as a tool that can be used to structure monitoring approaches, take you through a range of typical tools, including some of their advantages and disadvantages, introduce some key data sources, and highlight some best practice. So I've put key terms at the top of the presentation, but actually this is peppered through some of the introductory slides. So as I talk through the benefits, logic mapping, and some of the tools, there are some definitional slides throughout. Okay. So before we get going, I just wanted to use this diagram to give an overview of the project lifecycle and place monitoring and evaluation within that. So you can see on the bottom there's sort of the typical project lifecycle over time. So the project starts, delivery is ongoing, and the project is then completed. So I wanted to use the slide mainly to highlight that monitoring is an ongoing process that occurs continuously as the project is delivered. So the project delivery and monitoring, data collection, and any processes for processing or storing data are concurrent. And there are two main reasons that I wanted to highlight this. The first of which is that it means that when you start to plan your project delivery, what you should also be doing is planning your monitoring delivery so that both of these processes can be happening at the same time and can occur smoothly. And the second is also to highlight that it's the monitoring data which is collected throughout the project that feeds into the evaluation. So you can see the evaluation takes place there on the right-hand side of the screen after the project is completed. So there are two things. One is planning for monitoring to occur throughout project delivery, and the second is ensuring that the monitoring data collection feeds into the evaluation that needs to happen at the end. So that's sort of linking to this argument around having an internal logic that I'll make later on with the logic map. So some key terms here, monitoring and evaluation. So as I said, monitoring is ongoing alongside project delivery, and the objective in doing monitoring is to check progress of project delivery against any planned objectives and to ensure that any resources or outputs are delivered successfully. Evaluation, as I said, occurs at the end of a project's life cycle, and this is mainly about understanding what has been achieved, so assessing the effectiveness of project delivery and assessing performance against intended plans to understand what has been achieved. A third definition that I included here in this slide, but isn't in the focus of this presentation or on the diagram, is appraisal, but I wanted to include it to highlight that actually this occurs in a very different time scale than monitoring and evaluation. So this occurs prior to any commitment around project delivery or funding. So this occurs, if you imagine that diagram to the far left of the screen. So I just wanted to highlight that this is occurring in a very different time frame to monitoring and evaluation, which are much later on or further along the development of a project's life. But what are the benefits of monitoring and evaluation? So there are many. I've included here a number of sort of specific benefits and reasons to carry out monitoring and evaluation. I wanted to, I suppose, summarize these in three umbrellas. So one of the main ones is understanding impact. I think this is especially key for some of the more specific bullets further down the screen. So understanding what has been successful or not successful is crucial for being able to demonstrate that the project delivery is value for money, or to justify why an investment has been made in certain activities. And that's very much linked to transparency around funding decision making. So it's very important to be able to demonstrate what has been achieved with funds that have been spent. A second, I think, key umbrella here is about learning lessons from the delivery process. So this is understanding what has been successful, but also what has not been successful, and is a mechanism for feeding learning into future product delivery and improving the delivery of services, which in turn should help to achieve more impact. A key part of that and learning lessons from the delivery is gathering feedback from beneficiaries and stakeholders. So that's another reason why you may want to carry out monitoring and evaluation, is to gather feedback. And the third, I think, key umbrella is around influence, and there are two prongs that influence could go in. So one is influencing decision making or policy making. So evidence-based decision making can use what's gathered from project delivery to demonstrate why certain decisions or policies or targets should be implemented. And a second avenue of influence is around business development or access to funding. So a really crucial part of accessing finance to ensure the continuity of service delivery is about demonstrating success in the past. So yeah, multiple reasons why you may want to invest in monitoring and evaluation. I think oftentimes monitoring and evaluation is done because it is a funder or government requirement, but I really think it's important to illustrate that there are much wider benefits or impacts from investing in monitoring and evaluation, having robust, comprehensive approaches. Designing a monitoring and evaluation approach. So as an overview, this is sort of, I guess, 4 key steps that structuring an approach would go through. So the first and primary step, which is probably the most important, is to understand what the project is. So what is being delivered, who is the target audience, how often are the interventions being delivered, and what are the expected results. So it's really important to understand the context of the project delivery and the specific activities. And I'll go through in more detail later on, but a logic map can be a very good tool for understanding this. The second key point is to identify the outputs or outcomes to be measured. So I'll define these on the next slide. But the outputs or outcomes are generally the 2 components of the project that a monitoring and evaluation approach would be structured around. So that's really the focus of what tools are chosen for the monitoring and what data is collected. Yeah, so once you understand the outputs and outcomes, select the appropriate monitoring tools. So that involves a negotiation between not only the outputs and outcomes and an understanding of the project, but a consideration of funding, timescale, what is realistic and feasible. And the final stage is to develop a monitoring plan. So this concretizes sort of all the decisions that have been made around the monitoring approach, and should clearly outline roles and responsibilities and what needs to happen when. In terms of key terms, so outputs and outcomes are often confused, but they're crucial to designing a monitoring and evaluation approach, and quite different. So an output is a deliverable unit from an activity. So they're usually quantitative, and examples are things like the number of events, number of participants, number of activities. So that's an output from any project activity. An outcome is a short to medium term change. So this is a directly observable impact from the delivery of outputs. And they're usually phrased in terms of an increase or decrease because they refer to a change. And yeah, in the short to medium term. So often what can be directly observable from the project's beneficiaries or stakeholders, rather than wider impacts in society. I included the term key performance indicator here because it's often discussed alongside outputs and outcomes. And the reason for this is because outputs and outcomes can all be key performance indicators. But key performance indicators or performance indicators are management measures of performance. So it's sort of a framing in terms of a management overview of performance rather than monitoring and evaluation, if that makes sense. So yeah, I wanted to include that there as a distinguishing term. Okay, so it's coming to a logic map. So it's often called a logic framework as well, but it's a commonly used tool to understand sort of project delivery, but also can play a key role in structuring a monitoring and evaluation approach, because it does marry up what the project activities are alongside the outputs and outcomes, which dictate what should be measured. So the logic map starts, if you can, it has internal logic, so can be read either from left to right or right to left. You should be able to follow through from what the inputs are all the way to the intended impact, or from the impact work backwards to what the inputs should be. So the inputs refers to what is things like resources or activities that are delivered as part of a intervention. These inputs then lead to outputs. So outputs are, as I referred to on the previous slide, quantitative sort of units of delivery. So things like number of activities, number of events. These activities and events lead to a change, a directly observable change in the short to medium term, which is the outcome. And as a result of these outcomes, you may be able to observe an impact, which is a more long-term change in the wider community. So monitoring is usually focused on capturing data from a project based on what the outputs and outcomes are. So I should say that evaluation can also be focused on impacts. So impact evaluations are much more time intensive, resource intensive to implement. They involve technical considerations of things like the counterfactual for your project, so can be more technically difficult to implement and more resource intensive. So generally, when you're considering a program or project, your evaluation will be focused on outcomes. So this will be the directly observable change as a result of what has been delivered. Inputs are usually also monitored as part of project delivery, but this is usually as part of management processes and not necessarily as part of the evaluation process. So to illustrate the kinds of outcomes that you might be seeing in active travel schemes and might be needing to structure a monitoring and evaluation approach around, we use this table. So this has been pulled together from examples from past active travel delivery. And so some common outcomes are increased cycling and walking, improved actual and perceived cyclist safety, health benefits from increased cycling and walking, reduced car kilometers, improved access to local amenities and transport hubs, increased number of cycling and walking trips to schools and workplaces. And so we can see that each of these outcomes is phrased in terms of a change, so an increase, an improvement, or a decrease. And the way that these outcomes are used to develop a monitoring and evaluation approach is that each of these outcomes is directly linked to something that needs to be measured, so a metric. Now, if we take the first example, so increased cycling and or walking, this is an outcome which is linked to the metrics change in number of cycling and walking trips or change in the number of people cycling or walking. So from this outcome, it's understood that what needs to be measured is the number of people cycling and walking. So that's the metric around which the monitoring approach needs to be structured, and that dictates the type of monitoring tool that needs to be chosen as part of the monitoring approach. The same is true for any of the subsequent outcomes. So they will have a corresponding metric or something that needs to be measured in order to understand that change, and it is that which determines the tool that should be used. In terms of selecting the tool, there's a wide range of tools that can be used to capture data around active travel. So these are both quantitative and qualitative. So on this slide, the green, all those tools that are in green are quantitative tools, and those in purple are qualitative tools. So qualitative tools are more experiential around capturing perceptions, and quantitative tools will be numerical in nature that will involve some sort of quantitative analysis to process the data. The tools range from surveys, so that can be school or workplace travel surveys, station surveys, or route user surveys, and counts on the quantitative side, so automatic counts, cycle parking counts, or manual counts. I'll go through each of these tools in more detail on the following slides. And the qualitative tools are interviews or focus groups. So starting with automatic cycle counters. So automatic cycle counters are usually positioned on the side of a path that is used by either pedestrians or cyclists or both. They can count either one of the two modes or both at the same time, depending on the type of counter that they are. So they record user numbers on an hourly basis. So it's a purely quantitative tool. In terms of their installation, so they can be quite costly to install. So in terms of understanding usage across a wide or broad area, it may not be feasible to use automatic cycle counters because of their cost. And there are a couple considerations to do with their installation. So they shouldn't be installed where there are likely to be large groups of users passing through the count field, because that may confuse the count, or where there's stationary or slow-moving traffic. Depending on the type of counter used, so those which use inductive loop technology can be disrupted by magnetic fields nearby, so train tracks or overhead power lines. So those are a few considerations in their installation. They have advantage in that they're continuous, so they are able to collect continuous count data that is based on actual user numbers rather than an extrapolation, and they provide an understanding of the change in usage over time, so over the time period of a day and over the time period of a year. So that's an understanding of seasonality. So it's very comprehensive sort of quantitative count data that can be obtained through automatic cycle counters. Some of the weaknesses are, as I said, they are quite costly to be installed. There are issues with battery life, and they are potentially targets for vandalism, which can also affect the sort of consistency of the count. And as I said, they are a purely quantitative count-based tool, so you will not obtain any information around the origin or destination of the users or the demographics of users through automatic cycle counters. As an alternative to cycle counters, you could also use manual counts. So manual counts involve an individual manually recording the number of users at a specific site, so usually standing on the side of a pathway. This is usually done over a number of days and selection of hours. So the Sustrans recommendation is to carry out a manual count for 12 hours each day, usually between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. and on a selection of days, avoiding days which are not traffic neutral, so avoiding Monday, Friday, and Sunday, as these are non-typical travel days. They can be affected by the weather, so it's important to note down the weather when any count is being conducted. And if the counts are being used for evaluation purposes, the same selection of days and hours should be used in both time periods, so before and after the intervention, to allow for a robust comparison. In terms of indicative costs, they are less costly than cycle counters, but not cheap. So they do still involve an investment because of the need for an individual to be counting people. In terms of their advantages, so they can count in locations that might not be suitable for cycle counters for the reasons that I highlighted earlier. You may be able to cover more locations than you would with cycle counters at the same cost. Oh, someone in the chat. So for pedestrians, so the automatic cycle counters that are recommended for pedestrians are those which are installed or situated under the footway. So they're weight-based or weight-triggered counters. So they're usually installed under a footway. Rather than inductive loop technology. So inductive loop technology, that involves a laser, which as the metal frame of a bicycle passes through, counts the user. So those are generally not bimodal. But yeah, the weight-triggered pathway counters count pedestrians. If they're installed on a pathway which is used by both users, then they'll count both users. Sorry for that. So going back to the, oh, wait. Going back to the manual count advantages and disadvantages. So as I said, yeah, you can conduct a manual count in locations where you may not be able to install a counter, and you may be able to cover more counters in the same budget for your monitoring. And they can be a robust way to compare usage pre and post if you carry out a manual count on a sufficient number of days. So carrying out a manual count on one day, for example, would not be considered sufficient as an indication of usage. So a minimum of 4 days is recommended to capture a sample from across the week, as this provides an understanding of variation in usage across the week, which can then be extrapolated across the year. As I said, they can be subject to weather interference or event interference, so it's best not to schedule manual counts for days when there might be a fun run, for example, taking place. And yeah, as I said, manual counts is only statistically robust if the data is collected over sufficient time periods. So that's a sufficient number of hours per day and a sufficient number of days to be able to capture enough variation that you can have confidence that the results are representative of usage as a whole. Oh, okay. Yeah. Another form of capturing user data or user count data can be to carry out a root user survey. So these are usually surveys carried out concurrently with a count. So you're obtaining both information on the number of users using the route, as well as some additional supplementary information gathered through the survey. So the survey can include any type of questions, but commonly includes questions around the demographics of users and detail on trip information. So the type of trip being made, perhaps the frequency, the trip purpose, origin and destination is also possible to capture. And a key benefit for evaluating schemes can be to also ask questions around the perception or level of satisfaction with the infrastructure or route provision. So that can be a way of measuring user satisfaction with what has been delivered as part of an evaluation. Again, should be conducted over a set period of time and number of days, recommended 12 hours per day and a minimum of 4 days. And in terms of indicative costs, they are similar to manual count, but slightly more costly because there's more data collection activity occurring. In terms of the strengths, you can obtain quite rich data on usage. So not only are you understanding how many users are using the route, but you understand also their motivations for doing so. And as I said, you can also capture some perception information. So this is quite rich data around usage. Yes, it can, in terms of weaknesses, they can be difficult to have good response rates, especially also when the weather is poor. So the same way that manual counts are affected by weather as are user surveys. And you are only surveying individuals at one specific site. So if a route is particularly long, for example, then a consideration needs to be made around whether the information gathered at one location can apply to the entire length of the route. And it also means that you're not surveying potentially people who are not using the route and therefore not getting an understanding of any of the barriers to using the route. So it is only about people who are using the route. School or workplace travel surveys. Sample size for a user survey. So in terms of sample size, it's difficult to say if there's a minimum sample size you should have. I think what's more crucial is that you want, so amongst the different groups of users that could be counted. So say you're on conducting a user survey on a path in which there are both cyclists and pedestrians, you want to be aiming for a balance of both user groups. So you don't want necessarily 90% cyclists and 10% pedestrians in your survey. So if this is why you have to do the count at the same time as the user survey. So you'll have your count showing you what's the accurate quantitative balance of users. So if the accurate number of users is 90% of the users are cyclists and 10% are pedestrians, that's fine. But you don't want your survey to reflect that. So you want to be getting kind of an equal balance in the survey from both user groups so that you understand enough about the usage of both of those groups. That makes sense. So in terms of like a minimum sample size, generally we haven't, there's no rule of thumb. It's more about how representative the survey answers look compared to the count. And that affects some of the analysis techniques you can use robustly or not. So if your survey doesn't seem representative according to the count, then you might not be able to do some of the extrapolation analysis that you normally would. I'm trying to think if there's anything else around sample size. I think generally it's just important to collect over a large enough sample of hours and days. So it's the same as a manual count, that you're not over attributing the usage on the route to one day where there may have been something that affected the usage. So say it was bad weather and you only carry out the user survey on one day, your results will be skewed by the bad weather, or same if there was some sort of event that made people cycle or walk more, you would get skew. So you want to get a large enough sample of days that you don't have your data affected by that. Do you do the route user survey before and after? Yeah, so you can do it before and after. Yeah, so if you were, say you were delivering a junction improvement and you wanted to see how that changed usage of that location, you would do one beforehand to see how many users are using the location. You might also ask them some questions about their perception of the location. So do you feel safe using this route beforehand? And then you would do the exact same thing afterwards. And the important thing is, if you do that before and afterwards, you want to carry out the survey and count on the same days. Not necessarily the same people. So yeah, you wouldn't be able to control if it was the same people or not. It would be different samples of people. Yeah, it would just be whoever is using the route. It might be some of the same, but because we don't, and you wouldn't necessarily know. Yeah, you wouldn't necessarily know. Yeah. Okay. So going back to the tools, so the school or workplace travel surveys. So these are essentially surveys around understanding the mode of travel to either a school or a workplace institution. So they're mostly relevant for the delivery of schemes or projects that are seeking to change that type of behavior. So if anything is being delivered in terms of behavior change or infrastructure in and around a school, then you may want to consider capturing data on school travel. Any similar to a workplace, then this type of tool would become relevant. Things to bear in mind that they often require some assistance or collaboration with sort of staff members from the institution, so from the school or workplaces. And it's worth, I suppose, thinking through mechanisms for the data collection, so both for children and what are appropriate questions and mechanisms for data collection for children that will allow you to get valuable data. Similar for workplaces, whether or not you want to offer incentives for responding. These have been found to have better response rates in the past, and especially around workplaces, but can also happen in schools. It's sometimes worth checking what data is already collected, because some of these institutions will have data collection processes in place that may actually be able to be used without any new data needing to be collected. In terms of indicative costs, they can be quite cheap to implement, but often this is contingent on having a sort of partnership arrangement with the institution that can support the data collection. They're very useful for providing evidence on the impact of travel to school or workplace. But as I said, this is probably only relevant if the delivery is relevant to travel to a school or workplace. Right. So the school or workplace travel surveys, again, as I said, they are usually delivered with some degree of cooperation from the schools or workplaces. If there isn't a partnership working arrangement in place, logistics may be more difficult or expensive. Especially around schools, it's important to consider sort of ethical or security clearance for capturing data. Okay. So cycle parking counts. So this is these involve an individual counting the number of parked bicycles at a set number of locations at specific time periods. So usually this is done on one day over a year that is chosen, and to capture change over time, usually the same day is used every year. So someone would go out on the same day every year and count the number of parked bicycles at a specific location. There's often used at a sort of a site of special interest or a point of interest, like a public transport station or potentially a sports stadium, to understand access to that point by cycling. So it's not a foolproof system, because sometimes if cycle parking facilities are better than in surrounding areas, that could be displacing cycle parking from surrounding areas onto this one location, whether or not people are visiting that location. In terms of the data collection, usually 2 hours are selected, one in the morning peak between 8 a.m. and 11 a.m., and one in the evening peak between 3 p.m. and 6 p.m. And the same individual would go around for an hour in the morning peak and an hour in the evening peak to count the parked cycles. Fairly low cost, especially compared to some of the other tools that I've gone through. So they can be used as supporting evidence, as I said, particularly relevant where a scheme is interested in influencing access to a specific point. And it can be used to understand where there may be more cycle parking infrastructure needed. So if there's sort of overcrowding of the infrastructure observed, that can indicate that more infrastructure is needed. As I said, they don't always indicate an increased number of cyclists, and it's not robust enough as a tool to demonstrate mode shift. So increased number of parked bicycles is not sufficient to demonstrate mode shift. Station surveys, so these are again focused on access to stations, where individuals who are arriving at a station are asked what travel mode they use to access a station. May also be asked journey distance or how often they travel to the station. In terms of indicative costs, higher than the park bicycle counts, because they involve an individual stopping people and recording the data. They're mostly just relevant for schemes where you're seeking to influence access to a public transport hub or a station. Can, I guess, be weak in making inferences around mode shift, as with the parked bicycles, and a large enough sample is usually quite recommended and can be more costly to get. Okay, so moving on to the qualitative tools. Maybe I'll just pause and see if there's any more questions on the quantitative tools that I've been through before I keep going. Nothing else has come up. No. Okay, so I'll keep going. So the focus groups are one of the main qualitative tools that are used, and they're a way of gathering in-depth feedback from local community or a stakeholder group on what has been delivered. They can also be conducted before anything is delivered to inform the design. So there's sort of two ways they can be used, either to capture feedback at the end or to inform the design. I think on their own, not able to provide a very robust assessment, but can provide very, very useful context and understanding. In terms of delivery of the focus groups, it's usually recommended to have 2 facilitators. So one to implement the logistics and capture notes, and another to facilitate the group verbally. A group size of no more than 10 individuals is recommended. This is because one of the potential pitfalls of focus groups is that potentially louder voices can derail the discussion or move the discussion in one particular direction, and this avoids hearing from the range of voices that are present. To get the most out of focus groups, you should consider using facilitation techniques to maximize engagement. So that can involve sort of voting activities or the use of post-it notes and some audience participation to maximize what comes out of the focus group. In terms of indicative costs, they are quite costly because of both the time investment and the need for 2 facilitators. So they are very effective at gathering in-depth feedback and understanding the why of what has occurred. So if you, for example, have observed results that are not expected, it can be very useful to carry out a focus group to understand why this is the case, because quantitative methods alone won't answer the why. So they will show you the phenomenon that has happened, but not often be able to explain that in detail. As I said, there's a risk that stronger voices may lead the session. So it's important to have both a facilitator who is mindful of that and also to contain group sizes. And an incentive is often needed to maximize participation. Another qualitative technique that can be used is interviews. So these can be either structured, so very formalized structured interviews with a set series of questions, semi-structured, so a few series of questions but with some permissiveness in terms of having a wider discussion, or entirely unstructured, so sort of open-ended seeking of feedback. And these can be conducted, as with a focus group, either prior to the delivery of a scheme to feed into design, during, or after. And they provide an opportunity to assess the range of impacts that can happen. So you can understand impacts at a personal level for the individual themselves, at a case study level, so demonstrating what the project has achieved using the effect on the individual, or a beneficiary level. And the interviews can be conducted during the project implementation, can unpick how people are engaging with the project. So this is part of, I suppose, monitoring as part of an ongoing process to identify what may or may not be working, and identify if any changes need to be made. It's more relevant in the context of behavior change projects, where if you're delivering engagements to change people's behavior, you may want to conduct interviews to see how they're interacting with that and identify if any changes might need to be made. So the interviews can be coded and analyzed that way, the same way as focus groups. It can be a time-consuming process, or can be written up as case studies. It's necessary to obtain consent, both to capture the data from individuals and around whether or not they want to be included anonymously. In terms of cost, can be less costly than focus groups to implement, depending on the number that are carried out, but still more costly than some of the quantitative tools. As with the focus groups, they allow for very rich information to be captured about experience and the impact, although on their own, not necessarily a robust tool, but can be a very good complement to quantitative data collection. Okay. Moving on from them tools to some key data sources that are also relevant to sort of walking and cycling and understanding walking and cycling, some of which can be used as part of monitoring approaches, but are more just useful for awareness, especially in considering the context in which delivery takes place. So a few can be used for count information. So the DFT traffic count points, there are a series of traffic count points across the country, which are either monitored on an annual basis, or data from other monitored sites is used to extrapolate the counts on an annual basis. So that can be used to provide count information where there is no other option. Census information also provides a percentage of individuals cycling to work, which may be able to be used as part of monitoring. Stats 19 provides police records of killed and seriously injured incidences for pedestrians and cyclists. So where schemes are interested in understanding the impact on safety, Stats 19 is a useful objective secondary source, but be aware this only includes sort of objective reporting of incidences. So this doesn't include any consideration of perception of safety, any near misses. It's only what has been reported, so reported incidents. The National Travel Survey, again, lots of information at a national, very aggregate level on the travel modes being used, frequency of travel, that sort of thing. So not necessarily so useful at a kind of local project level, but for an overview of travel can provide some context. The Active People Survey provides a number of indicators around health and physical activity. So yeah, that is broken down by local authority, so may provide some indicators on physical activity, although I think in terms of regularity, it's published every, is it annually or biannually? So in terms of the time scale of a project may or may not be relevant, especially considered the large scale. And the propensity to cycle tool provides a means of modeling potentially what increases in cycling would look like in a local area. So can provide, I suppose, an understanding of potentially targets to be achieved, but not necessarily used as part of a monitoring approach. So there's just some key data sources that you might also want to consider looking at when designing a monitoring and evaluation approach. In terms of best practice when designing a monitoring and evaluation approach, there's a few pointers. So as I mentioned at the start, one of the main reasons why monitoring and evaluation is needed is because it's a funder requirement. So it's important to understand specifically what the funder requirements are, including their reporting requirements. So the reporting requirements and deadlines will dictate by when the data needs to be collected and processed for any reporting. So in terms of timelines, understanding funder requirements around that are incredibly important. What you need are clearly defined project objectives or outcomes. So it needs to be very clearly established what the project is trying to achieve and therefore what the monitoring needs to demonstrate. So those two, the interaction of the monitoring approach with the project outcomes is really integral for having a logic to the monitoring approach and ensuring that you haven't collected data that isn't then useful for demonstrating the intended outcomes of the project. Developing a monitoring plan is a very useful exercise and tool. So this should be a document which captures all the key information relevant to the monitoring approach. This should include roles and responsibilities, who is doing what the reporting arrangements are, the key deadlines, milestones, timelines, so project management information, and should also provide an outline of the monitoring approach. So this should include what tools are being used as well as the intended focus of the tools, so the intended audience and type of questions. So this monitoring plan should really comprehensively outline everything that anyone needs to know as part of delivering a monitoring and evaluation approach successfully. Good communication between the individuals who are carrying out delivery of the project and the individuals responsible for monitoring and evaluation is really important. So it's important to have open communication so that any changes to delivery are then sort of fed through to any changes in monitoring and evaluation to ensure that the monitoring is then not capturing things which are no longer relevant to delivery. So there should be clear communication on both sides, both at the beginning. So as I highlighted, when the project is being set up, this is when monitoring should start to be discussed so that a really clear process and approach can be implemented to be carried out at the same time as the delivery process. And monitoring and evaluation should be proportionate to the intervention. So this is when considerations around funding, scale, and scope come into play. So this will determine, again, the number of tools that can be used, the scale and scope of the monitoring, and this should all be proportionate to what is being delivered. So yeah, it's another pointer. Okay.